Hello, guys. Welcome to assignment 10. In this assignment, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working with materials. We're going to apply materials to our pavilion. We're going to apply materials to um, our panel skin that we have, and we're also going to apply materials to our outer skin. Um, as far as what materials we're applying, for the rafters, we're going to apply the wood. For the metal panels, we're going to apply a metal material that we're going to do. And for the outer skin, I'm going to leave that open to you. You can see my pavilion has glass. I'll just go over how to make glass, and you guys can experiment from there. Um, what this assignment is going to be doing, we're going to do all the materials of all of our sheets. That means that you need to submit assignment 10, and that will require you to submit all the sheets. With that in mind, please take some time to clean up any viewports that may have other geometry on them. Please make sure that you're modifying the colors uh, with the layout colors that we went over. Just don't just print black and white. We're moving away from that. All the 3D views are going to be reworked, and all the 3D views must contain a material on them. All the 3D views need to have a texture applied to it. You can see that my rafter views in here have the wood in here. If it's a plan, you don't have to do anything to the 3D view. If it's a perspective or isometric, you do have to apply materials and show all the textures. Do not worry about the shadows just yet, because we're going to cover that on assignment 11. We're going to cover materials only for assignment 10, and then assignment 11 is going to be environments and shadows. So you don't have to worry about shadows for this assignment. And once you do all that, please make sure everything is in place, and please make sure everything is showing materials, and just resubmit. Okay, so let's jump into Rhino, and let's start talking about what we're gonna do for this assignment. Okay, so let's go into Rhino, and what we're gonna do, we're just going to start with basics about the materials, and then just work our way up to what we're gonna be doing in our assignment. In order to understand more the materials and the techniques that we're gonna be doing in this assignment, what I want to do, I want to take some time and just show a few things that you need to be aware of when using materials. And pretty much what I'm doing in here, I'm just creating a cube and a couple spheres, just so that we can play around with the materials before we dive into our project. So the way that materials work, we have a tab in here that lets us pick a certain material, or lets us create a material from scratch. We're going to be using the default materials that we have in Rhino, and then in assignment 11 we might create a new material from scratch, but pretty much assignment 10 is just the basics of materials. Right after you open your material tab, you're going to notice that we don't have a material at all, and that's because we haven't loaded a specific material, or we have not created a material just yet. In order to do that, you have to click this plus button that you see here. Your view might look different than mine, and that's because I modified mine a little bit. Yours should look just like this. I find it more useful to have all my materials on the left. That's why I create I modify my view. If you want to do that too, you can just follow along as well. But what I did, I just created on these 3 lines here, and then I just say horizontal layout, and that brings all my materials on the left, and then the properties on the right. You don't have to do that, but if that makes more sense to you, you can do it. Um, Nevertheless, to create a new material, uh, we need to click on this plus button in here. Once we click this plus button, it's going to tell you what type of material you would like to create. And these guys are just presets that Rhino has created in order to speed up the process of creating a material from scratch. These presets are really good to have something really rough to start with. These presets are going to be some of the presets that we're going to use in our project, and then we're just going to tweak them a little bit. So let's just start from that. Let's just create one that happens to be a plastic. So I'm just going to select this plastic preset. And right after I do that, notice that Rhino created a preview up here with the name plastic. And right now it's highlighted in blue. That means that we can just rename it. We can call it something something that it's pertinent to this project. I'm just going to call it plastic 1, just so that you can see that we can change the name. After we rename this, you can see that there's a little thumbnail showing a smaller preview of this bigger preview in here. You could either turn on or off the preview by going again in here and then just say turn off preview. But I find it better if you see what's happening in here. You can make this preview bigger or smaller. It's really how your workspace is defined. If you have a big screen or a small screen, that's something that you could do when you're creating these materials. After we have the preview and we have it set up just like we want it, the next thing is to go over the settings that are here below. You can see that the name says plastic 1, which is the same name that we have up here. The type, this is the type of template that we started using. We're going to leave it as plastic, and once you pick the type is going to be displayed here with more settings that you could change. Notice how we have plastic in this drop down arrow, and we have a color box in here. If we click the box in there, we can change the color to anything that we like. I'm just going to pick a blue hue, and then I'm going to click OK. You can see that now the preview is updating and it's showing a blue plastic in there. You can change how reflective this plastic is by just moving the scroll in here, or you can change how transparent this is, and you can see that it's being updated on the preview in there. Depending on your machine or your computer that you have, this might be really, really fast, or it might be really, really slow. If your computer is slow, you can decrease the size of the preview, and that's going to make it easier on your computer to generate that preview. Nothing really nothing really difficult about these sliders. You can play around with these. Clarity in this is just how much you can see through the reflection. You can see that if you bump it all the way up, you can see all the reflections of your environment. And then the bump texture is if you want to add some sort of relief to your material. And you might need to play with the scale just so that you could see it. You can kind of see it in here. There's a bump going on in there. Let's see if I can make it extra small. You can start seeing it there. So that's pretty much all you can do with the materials. I'm going to set this back to none for the bumps. And let's say that we just finish our material and we want to apply it to one of our objects. Now, there's two ways of doing this. There is the first one is by selecting an object and then applying the material to it. And the other one is by applying the material to the entire layer. I believe in our case, it's going to be easier if we apply the materials to the layer. So let's start with that method first. So in order to do that, let's go back into our layer tab. Once we're in our layer tab, you can see that we have all of these layers in here. So I'm going to start renaming a few. I'm just going to call this sphere 1. And notice that in the layer, we have a column that says material, and it has a white dot in here. When it has a white dot, it means that there's nothing assigned to it. If we click on that white dot, you can see that it has a material, and it's the default material, which is this white material here. That's this soft light material that doesn't cast a lot of shadows or doesn't have any reflections. In order to change the material that is assigned to the layer, you can see here, if you follow my mouse, it says layer material. It's set to default. So just click this drop down arrow and set it to plastic 1, which is the material that we just created. Now you have the ability to further tweak your material here, and all of these settings are linked to the material tab. So whatever changes you make in here, while you are applying it to a layer, they're gonna be affected on the materials tab. So just keep that in mind. So I'm gonna click OK. And notice that my sphere 1 has the plastic 1 material in here. And notice that none of my spheres have it, and that's because my spheres currently are in the default layer, because I just created the spheres and the cube, but I didn't set it to any of my layers. Now, if we select the object and move it to our layer, notice that by default, it's just going to change the material in there. Now, let's say that we just want to apply the material to specific objects rather than applying it to the layer itself. And the way to do that is by selecting an object. But before we do that, let's just make another material just so that we have two materials to play with. In this instance, I'm going to pick a glass, give it a color. Maybe this is a yellowish glass. I'm going to rename this. If you already accepted the name and you want to modify it, you can click twice and rename it, or you can just right click and say rename. Notice that it is changing, and that's because Rhino is calculating how it's going to look once it's rendered on the final pass. That's why it takes some time for it to display the preview, and that's just because this material it has reflections, and then it's translucent, so it's a little bit more heavy. So I'm going to go back into my layers and click this object right here, and let's figure out what layer is this object on. Notice that this object is on layer default. And in order to change the material of this, notice that we have more options here once we select an object. Take a look at my properties and how they change, how they react when I select an object. See how I get more items when I select my sphere? That means that this sphere has more properties that can be customized. One of those properties is material. You can click on that material and see that by default, this object is set to use the layer material. That means whatever layer this material is on, it's going to inherit the materials of that specific layer. We could choose to just say, I would like to have this object, and then just apply the material in here, and that's just gonna change the material of that specific object regardless of the layer. So that's a very important concept about the materials in here. Notice that it's not showing the nice reflectivity of our preview, and that's because when we're working in Rhino, the render mode is just a preview of the actual render. Once we switch it to another ray trace preview mode, that's going to give you the final result of your materials. For us, if you work on just render, it should be fine. We're not going to do any final renderings just yet. That's going to be coming on the next assignment. But for now, if you have it in render style in all your viewports, you should be fine. So that's the basics of the materials, of the default materials. Now let's dive a little bit into custom materials. And we're not going to recreate one custom material from scratch just yet, but rather what we're going to do is we're going to use the library that Rhino comes with to show a material that has a texture, and we're going to modify the texture a little bit just so that we could get it to show a specific way. And that specific way is going to be dependent on our object. For example, in our rafters that we have in our pavilion, they're curved. So we need to replicate that curvedness in our material. And we're going to talk about how to do it and how to go about it. But for now, let's just talk about how to bring a custom material from our library. And the way we do that is by going into our material tab and selecting this plus button and say import from material library. So I'm going to select that folder in here. And as soon as we do that, you're going to see that Rhino opens a location in our computer, and this location has different categories of materials that Rhino comes preloaded with. If for any reason your computer doesn't have these materials, what you need to do, I'm going to hit cancel, and I'm going to run a command that is called download library textures. Now, if you don't have these textures and then you're trying to follow this tutorial, what you could do is just go and type download library textures in our command bar. And because I already have them, it's telling me that if I would like to overwrite the existing ones, I'm going to say yes. And then you can see that it's going through the process of downloading these libraries or these materials and putting them in that specific folder that we open at the beginning. Now, this might take some time, so I'm going to pause this and I'm going to come back once it's finishing downloading this. And again, you don't have to do this if you see these material libraries at the beginning. Very important. Okay, let's say we downloaded those textures because we didn't have them, and then we're trying to create that custom texture material from our material library. So we're gonna select this plus button, select this import from material library option in here with the folder, and we're gonna navigate to the wood folder, and we're gonna pick, you're free to experiment with all of these materials. I'm just gonna pick something. It doesn't matter for now. I'm gonna pick this one, Fuma. I'm gonna click open, and notice that it has custom settings in here, you can see that the name displays the Fuma name, and then for the type is set to custom. And within custom, there is multiple sub menus that we have. One of them is the textures. And if you click this name right here, it's going to display the texture that it's using. You can see that this one looks a little bit funky. I don't know why it's looking like that. Let's pick another one. I don't know if it's just the material. Yeah, I think it's just the preview. You can see the texture in here. It shows fine. Just the preview for some reason is not updating in here. Nevertheless, let's just apply it to our sphere. Another way you can apply it, and I didn't mention this, is just by clicking an object and then just clicking your material and then just dragging that material to that object, and that's just gonna show the material in the preview. Okay, so I paused the video because for the next part, we really need to show the texture, and we need to be able to see the texture itself so that we can start rotating it in the faces. And because this is all pixelated and we cannot see it, I had to figure out why I was doing that. And the reason why is when we first bring in the material from the material library, it comes up with whatever defaults Rhino set it up with. And one of the defaults is this, the size of the picture when it's applied to the object is huge. So we just need to decrease it. And the way to do that, I'm just gonna show you how I did it. On that Fuma material that we have, under our sub settings that we have in our type, we can select the texture subsetting, and then we see that we have the name of the picture that we're using for our object as the texture. So we're going to click this Fuma 100 DP, and as soon as we do that, we get this settings in here. And what we need to do is scroll down to the mapping area, and you see the size that it says 100. We're just going to set it to 1 and 1. And now you can see that it's looking way better. Now we can visualize what this texture is. So if that happens to you, the way to fix that is by going into one of the options for the bitmap texture and decreasing the size of it. Okay, so I've been just playing with the materials just to see that everything is working fine. You saw me go back and forth from that render view style to that ray trace view style, which shows you a more accurate preview of it. Like I said before, just keep it in render if your machine is a little bit slow. Both of them show you real scale textures for our materials. Anyways, what we're gonna do is we're gonna start playing with the texture and how it interacts with the faces of our object. You can see that I'm gonna pick this cube here, and I'm gonna set it on layer 3, just because I want to use the layer to change or update my my textures that I have on my model. So you can see that now my cube has this material, which is the wood one, the wood material that we're going to be using for our rafters. Uh, Once we go into our projects, I'll just describe where it is and how to find it. But for now, all you need to know is that we have a texture applied to this cube, and the texture happens to have a certain direction to it, and that direction it changes as it goes from one face to the other face of the cube. Now, what we're trying to do is trying to uh, show a way, or trying to find a way in which we can start rotating these textures without really rotating any faces of our cube. And in order to do that, we're going to use a few tools that can be found in the properties. So whenever we're working with materials, what it's best to do is to isolate that specific object that you're working on. And to do that, you need to go into the visibility tab in here, and you're going to notice that we have a lot of buttons, but the one that you're going to use the most is isolating things. You can see that if you left click, you isolate an object, and if you go to this button and right click, you unisolate objects. So I'm just going to left click, and you can see that everything else disappears. And if I go back to this object and right click, you can see that everything else appears. So I'm going to select that object, left click to just isolate it, just so that I can see the object that I'm working on only. After I do that, I'm going to select the object, and I'm going to go into my properties of that object. Yours might look like this, right? This is the basic one, the default properties of our object. Because we have it selected, we have more sub options in here. The one that we're going to be playing with is the material, which, as we talked about before, we're going to be using the layer for that, so we don't need to modify this. The next one that we're going to be using is the texture mapping. And what it is, texture mapping lets you scale, rotate, or move textures of your material in the many faces of your object. Now, as far as all these options, these are more advanced options, and we're not really going to dive into these because we don't want to get confused, because these are very precise. And for what we're doing, we're just trying to rotate the texture and trying to get it to align to a certain way that it looks more realistic. So we're not going to talk much about all of these guys. The ones that we're going to use, you can see that I selected this texture mapping in here, and within that texture mapping, we have more options that we can pick with. There's only two that we're going to use in here. The ones that we're going to use are Unwrapped, which that means that we're going to tell Rhino which faces or how to unwrap a specific object. And when it unwraps, it displays the texture, and we can just move it around. We'll go over it in a second. And then we're also going to go into the UV editor, in which we can move the texture and how it interacts with the faces. So let's start with the unwrap option in here. So I'm going to click unwrapped. Notice that nothing really happens. It's just telling me select the seams. So I'm just going to select the bottom and the top. And I'm going to say apply. Once I do that, nothing happened. I just told Revit what were the seams to unwrap this object. And if I go into UV editor, that's the second option that we're going to use. Once I click that, if I click the UV editor, notice that the command prompt is asking me for a rectangle, and that's just so that it can display the texture and the faces on that. So all of these guys are going to be the faces. You can see that as soon as I highlight one, they all get highlighted. Now, mine, I can see a gray square in here, and that's because my ground is on. And if that happens to you and you want to see the texture, a way to fix that, if you go into the render tools, click this toggle environments panel, there is a tab that says ground plane. You can just turn it off. I'm going to exit this, and you can see that it's looking a little bit faint. I wonder if we switch it to shaded. Okay, now we can see it more. One of the things that I forgot to mention, when you're doing this UV editor, you have more options in here. You can see that there's an extra panel now on the right-hand side of our screen, and that extra panel has texture transparency. So if we decrease that transparency, you can see that now we can see the texture in here. Okay, now that looks way better. Let me switch it back to render. Okay, now we can see it in here. I wonder if that, oh, that doesn't matter. Okay, so it's more about the transparency. So whenever you go into the UV editor, make sure that the texture transparency is set all the way down. That way you can see your faces. Now you're wondering, what are these faces that we're talking about? But these faces in here are a little bit wrong because we're supposed to see the whole thing unwrapped. And what we're trying to do pretty much is that if we start scaling these faces in here, when we scale these faces, those changes are going to be shown on our cube. You can see now that because I scale the faces in here, whatever is inside this face in here, whatever texture is being captured on that boundary, is going to be shown on that specific face. So that's what we're trying to do. And you can use your gumball for this. You could rotate as well. If yours has a snap like mine is doing, you probably have your ortho on, so turn it off. And now you can see that because I rotated my face, the texture is rotating and not the actual face of the cube, but rather this symbolic face that we have here. Now this one is showing all the faces around. You can see that all the faces are shown in here, and it's an issue with our material. So let's fix that. So I'm going to hit apply. Otherwise, if I hit escape or cancel, all of the changes that we've done, they're going to revert back. So I'm just going to hit apply. Let's say I do want that. Notice that my UV editor just disappeared. That means we don't need it anymore. But we're trying to fix an issue with the texture. This is really important. When you get that error, we're going to go into materials, and under the bitmap texture of that specific material that you have, okay, you have to make sure that our mapping is set to channel. That's the only option that you need to remember. So it is set to channel. So we're going to select this one, go into properties, go into the texture mapping, and we're just going to say unwrap again. Let's just restart this whole process, and we're going to select the seams now. So I wonder if we select all of it, if it's going to separate all the faces. So I'm going to hit apply. notice that our texture changed already. If I go into, if I select the object, texture mapping, instead of unwrap, we're going to do the UV editor because we just want to rotate those faces. Okay, so because I selected all the lines as the seams, it separated all the faces on our texture in here. You can see that now. We can just start playing around with. Whenever you select a face, it highlights the face of that cube in there. They can overlap. You just need to keep track of where you're placing the faces. And I'm just going to apply. I just wanted to show the difference between where you put your seams. So I'm going to select this cube and then go into my visibility tab, and I'm going to right click to bring everything back. And now you can see that we play around with the textures. We didn't do much. I just wanted to show you the main concepts of it before we go into our project. So let's close down this one and let's redo this entire process again in our project. Okay, so we're back in our Rhino Pavilion. And before we dive into it, I know we said we were just going to jump into it, but I just want to show something real quick. You can see here that I have an image of a cube that is being unfolded. And when I was working on unwrapping it in Rhino, notice that I picked the seams, and what those seams are, it's just the areas that Rhino is gonna break so that it can unfold. So if you see this picture in here, notice that the seams are gonna be these lines in here, these lines in here, here, here. So everywhere where there's an opening for it so that it can unroll, that's going to be a seam. So I just wanted to show you that little example. I think it describes better how to unroll and what it does. All right, so let's go into our project, and we have our project here. And because we have so many things, or we had so many things, I just turned them off. We had so many things around our object. Our zoom is a little bit weird. So one way to fix that is selecting what we want to work with, and then just type ZS for zoom selected. And now we can just zoom around our object. It makes it easier when you're working with these materials. Now that we have this the way we want it, let's set our view to render, and notice that we don't have any materials. We only have that drop shadow that we have in here. So let's apply materials, and we're going to do it by layers as we discussed before. So let's just go into our material tab. Right now there's a metal material. I'm just going to delete it so that we can start fresh. I'm going to right click that material and say delete. It's just prompting me, are you sure you want to delete this material? It prompts you because sometimes you apply this material to objects, so it wants to make sure that you're aware that you're deleting a material that could be affecting multiple objects. So we're just going to say yes. Okay, so I'm going to click this plus button in here, and I'm going to generate a glass material, and I'm going to leave it like that. I like how it looks. Not going to tweak all the sub settings. You're welcome to do it for the glass and the metal. I'm going to click the plus button again, and I'm going to create my metal. And for my metal, I am going to tweak the color. And you can pick any color in this color wheel, or you can also pick a color that is predefined by Rhino. So I'm going to pick bronze color or probably just gold and click OK. Okay, now I have two materials and one more. I'm going to add my wood material. So I'm going to say import from material library. And once we're in this render content folder, we're going to navigate to wood, pine, and we're going to pick the one that says Scott Pine. Polish or unpolished is the same. It just one is glossier than the other one. So I'm just going to pick the polished one. So Scott Pine, polish, click open. And now we have three materials. And just so that we make sure that our textures are working fine, you can see that we can see it here in the preview. We can see everything. Okay. So let's just go into our layers. So for our skin, which is the outer one, I am going to use my glass material. Notice that it looks like it disappeared, but it's actually in there. It just, since we didn't play with the color, it's completely see-through. If I do my ray trace preview, we should be able to see it a little bit more clear. And it looks like it crashed. So that's one thing that could happen when you switch it from render to ray trace. Depending on your machine, it might crash, it might not. That's why I advise that you use it in render only. Now mine probably crashed, so I'm just gonna pause this and wait for it to come back, or just cancel this whole operation. Okay. So it looks like it actually came back a few minutes after I paused the video. So I'm just going to, in the glass, I'm just gonna add some color so that we could see our glass a little bit better. Now I put a little blue hue, and then you can see it here. So that's fine, and we're just gonna keep it from now on in the render view style. And let's switch back to the layers, and for the metal panels, what we're gonna do, we're gonna add that metal material that we just did, and that's fine. Once we start playing with the shadows and the environment, that metal is gonna look a little bit better. So the next thing that we need to do is to apply it to our rafters, and that's gonna be our Thicken Rafters. So I'm gonna click that layer and choose our Scots Pine Polish, and I'm gonna click OK. And I'm gonna turn off my metal and my skin just for a little bit, just to show you what we need to do. Notice that the braces are fine. I'm not too concerned about those and how they look. But what we need to fix is these objects in here. I'm going to isolate one. If you remember, you go into visibility and then left click to isolate that object. And if you see the texture in here, notice that it's going straight, and it would look better if we have it running the same direction as our curve. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna start playing with the settings that we just learned about, the Unwrapped and the UV editor, so that we can have this object shown a specific way, and that way is going to be so that the texture follows this curvature. So the first thing that we need to do is select the object, go into the properties, and navigate into our material, which is driven by the material layer, and select our texture mapping in here. And we are just going to, rather than unwrap it first, let's just see what's going on without doing anything. So let's just go into straight into the UV editor. So we're just going to click that UV editor, pick a point, excuse me, and pick another point. As described before, in order to see the texture in here, we need to decrease this transparency. Once we do that, we can see that there is a few things that we need to fix. One of the things is, notice that the inner face of our arc, this face right here, notice that that face, when it is unwrapped, it becomes deformed, and you can see that deformation by just selecting that area and seeing that it's not a straight line. It's a straight line, and then it becomes a diagonal line, and then a straight line again. So we need to address that in order to continue. The first thing that we need to do, like I said before, is to check the settings in our material texture. So we're just going to go back. We're going to hit cancel to this, and we're going to go back into the materials, and then we're going to go into our Scott Pine Polish. So we're going to select this, whatever properties that material has, they're going to be displayed on the right hand side. One of the properties is the textures. Within the textures, you can see that the color, it's an actual JPEG file, just like we talked about. We're just going to click the name of it. Notice that everything is fine. The size is at 3, which is fine. We can see it. The only thing that we need to address is this mapping channel. Notice that it says to WCS box style. Now, if you took a close look, when I was doing this, when I was clicking on the object and going into texture mapping, I had a warning here saying that some of this sign materials are using WCS, and therefore it's causing that deformation. So when we go into the materials, make sure that your Scott's Pine Polish is set to mapping channel. Okay. Once you do that, notice that the repeat changes. We're going to set it to 3 again, and 3. For some reason, it doesn't look as big, and that's because the texture itself is repeating 3 times in this entire object. That's what it means. So let's just set it to 12, and then 12, maybe 24. Just increase it a little bit more. That's better. That looks better. Okay, now that we fixed that, let's jump back into our properties. We don't have it in here. That's because we need to select it. Once we select the object, we can go under the texture mapping, and notice that we don't get that yellow warning that we had before. Before doing anything else, let's just see what we get. Let's do the UV editor. Select one point, select another point, and now notice how our textures come, our faces come. Notice that this entire thing is just is the interior face, the bottom face, and the upper face, which is fine. And then we also have this face, which is the front face of our object. And then we have this face, which is the back face of our object. Because these are not deformed now, what we could do, we could actually align them to this pattern we have here of our wood texture. So I'm just gonna select the face and use the gumball to make the scale of the object smaller. And then I'm gonna move it so that it is enclosing that area that I want to show on my face. Now, if we go into this face, notice that that pattern is being shown on all the faces that are on the exterior, which is what we want. Okay, so that was the entire outer and inner face. So it's all connected. Now, it's all connected because we didn't play with the seams like we did with the cube. If you guys remember with the Unwrapped, we went right into the UV editor. And when doing this assignment, it's better to go right into the UV editor first and see what you get. And if there's any tweaks, you can always go back into the Unwrap and define your seams and then go back into the UV editor. Since this one works fine, we're just going to keep it that way. And then the next thing is to fix the front and back face. And the front face has the texture going this way, and we want it to be following the curvature of our arc. So we're going to start with the front one. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to move this face somewhere else on my texture. And if I haven't mentioned it, you can move things by just clicking on it and then clicking on this box on the gumball, which is going to move it in the X and Y direction only and not on the Z. That's what I mean. Okay, so we're going to move it here. Just to make things clear, we're just going to rotate this one. And we're going to move it somewhere here. Somewhere here. Now for this one, which is the front face, notice that I went beyond the face of my texture in here. When that happens, it just repeats the texture. It doesn't show that that the texture is missing, just as an FYI. So I'm going to put it inside. It's better to have it inside, just so that you can visualize what you're doing. Okay, so we have the arcs here, and we want this to be following this texture right here of the wood. And the way to do that is by selecting this, and we're gonna deform it in a way that it becomes a straight line. And when it becomes a straight line, we can further define the scale of it. So let me show you how to do that. The first thing that we need to do is create a line, which is going to be our target line in here. So I just did a polyline in here. The second thing that we need to do is generate another polyline that happens to be on one of the edges of this curvature. And to do that, we're going to use a command that is called duplicate mesh edge. And we're going to click the edge, and notice how it's doing the entire edge on the upper side. And I'm going to hit enter. And all that it's doing is doing a line there. So now we have two things. We have a line here and a line down here. And notice that while we're doing this, I'm still inside my UV editor. I haven't left my UV editor. This is really important. When you're doing all this, make sure that you're inside your UV editor in here. Okay, so now we have one line there, one line there. And now in order to deform this face to follow the same curvature as that line, we're going to use a command that is called flow. And this is the same process of the flow along surface command that we used before, but flow is only for 2D elements. It doesn't require a surface. It doesn't require the object to be three-dimensional. It could be text. It could be lines. It could be faces. So we're just going to use flow. And if you follow the command prompt, it's saying it's asking for objects to flow along curve. So we're going to select our face. We're going to hit enter. And we're going to select the curve that we had on the upper side of this arc. Now you can't see it, but I'm going to select it right there, which is the first one right there. So that, and if you follow the prompt, is asking for the target curve. Before I hit the target curve or select the target curve, notice that it has copy set to yes. Make sure that this setting is set to no, because you can only have one face of this object in your UV editor. So make sure that the copy is set to no, and the stretch is set to yes, because we want to stretch it to that line. Everything else you can have it as no, no, and then it's just a line that we're using. So we're just going to hit the target, and notice how it took this face that we had here, use the line that we had as a reference, and then apply it to the line that we had as a target. It may look like this is a little bit deformed, but it is fine. It just happens that our arc is a little bit wider on the top. That's what it means in there. Now that we did this, let's see what happened to the front face. Now that we have done that, the front face actually follows the curvature of the texture. And that's because our face is deformed to follow the texture, and that is wrapped on that face. So let's do it again, and let's do it on the other side. To further define exactly what we want, I just want to have it having a little bit of that texture on the edge. You can see that it's right there. So what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to push this texture a little bit outside so that we don't see it that much. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to select that, move it either up or down, and notice that now in that face, we don't have that texture in there. We have it only on this arc part, which is fine. And let's just go back here. Notice that it is not shown in there. We do have that in there, but it's fine. Okay, so that's fine. That's good for the front face. Now let's do the back face. Okay, so I'm just moving my target line, and I'm going to say the command flow. I'm going to select my objects, hit enter, base curve. Now, if I select this as my base curve, it's not going to work because this curve was the base for my previous arc, the front face. This is for my back face. So I'm going to escape the command that I was on, and I'm going to run the duplicate mesh edge. So it's going to be DUP mesh edge, enter, and I'm going to select upper side, and it's going to select the entire edge. I'm going to click enter. That is going to create that curve in there. Now that I have my base curve and my target curve, I'm going to run my flow command. I'm going to select my surface, hit enter. It's prompting me for my base curve. I'm going to select my base curve, which is the one that we just generated. And then I'm going to hit my target curve. And that's going to deform that arc into that line. and I'm going to go through the same process. I'm just going to move it a little bit up so that it doesn't show that texture inside. And lastly, I'm just going to check. So that looks good. Okay. And that looks good. Perfect. So the last thing that we need to do before we hit apply is delete these lines in here that we created, because these were just for us to be able to deform those arcs. Once we do that, we can hit apply. And let's see what happens. You can see that Rhino is showing the texture just how we want it. Sometimes it's a little bit blurry, and that's just because this view is just a preview. But the main focus of this assignment is for you to be able to deform that geometry into the curvature of the arcs. Now, there's one more thing that I want to show you before we finish this front arc. If you select the object and go into the edge softening option on your properties, you can actually simulate the curvature of how an object is, because in real life there's no 90 degree angle for the wood. So if you turn that on and you set this to, let's say, 1 inch, you can see that it's showing the curvature of the wood. That just makes it a little bit more believable. So let's just set it to 0.5. I think 1 was a lot. So 0.5, and you can see some curvature here. Now, this doesn't affect your geometry at all. This only affects how Rhino is rendering the preview. So if I were to switch this back to shaded, you can see that it is displaying it. Okay. So that's something new. Okay. But if I try to select one face, you can see that the face itself is just one surface. It's not a fillet and another surface. So this is only for preview purposes or rendering purposes. I just wanted to show you that because that makes your renderings a lot more believable when you apply that that fillet edge. Now, as far as the assignment, what you need to do, let me get out of this isolate mode. What you need to do is replicate what I just did for the arc in all the arcs that we have, all the rafters that we have in our pavilion. So you're going to have to do it to this one, this one, this one, pretty much all of them. And you have to make sure that the curvature of your texture, or the texture follows the curvature of your rafter. That's what we're going after. Just because it looks more believable. You can see here, this one looks better than the one behind it. So that's the assignment for assignment 10. So you have to do that for all the rafters, and then you have to show all your textures in all your 3D views in the entire package that we've done so far. If there's any questions, please let me know. Don't hesitate to email me. And that's all I have for you guys this week.